Welcome to our podcast channel, a place where stories about life, love, and betrayal are told with depth and heartfelt emotion. Today, I'm bringing you a special story, one that not only revolves around betrayal in marriage, but also takes us through the journey of a man overcoming pain and rediscovering himself. This is not just the story of Sullivan, Aurora, and Brooke. It's a profound lesson about trust, the consequences of poor choices, and the strength to rise from the ashes. Get ready, because this story will keep you hooked from start to finish. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the latest stories from Eric. There was a time when Eric was excited by his work, something that prevented him from seeking the services of others. Sullivan Weston stood in the dimly lit garage, his hands caked with dust and grime. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting long shadows over the cluttered space. It was supposed to be a simple task, clearing out years of forgotten junk while his wife, Aurora, was away on one of her frequent business trips. Yet, as he tossed old tools and discarded boxes into a pile, something caught his eye. A suitcase, tucked away behind a stack of paint cans and a rusted lawnmower. The suitcase didn't belong. Sullivan knew the contents of his garage like the back of his hand, and this battered leather bag, with its brass latches dulled by age, was unfamiliar. A chill crept up his spine, an instinctual forewarning that something wasn't right. He hesitated before brushing off the dust and unfastening the clasps. Inside, he found chaos. Letters folded with care, photographs that seemed too intimate to be anything but personal, and a bundle of receipts bound by a red rubber band. His hands trembled as he sifted through the contents, each piece of evidence forming a jagged puzzle that he wasn't sure he wanted to complete. One photograph stopped him cold. It was Aurora, his wife of 8 years, laughing beside a man Sullivan had never seen before. The intimacy in her smile, the way her body leaned into this stranger, it wasn't the expression of a woman casually posing with a friend. Beneath the photograph was a receipt, dated 3 weeks ago, for a stay at a luxury resort in Chicago. His pulse thundered in his ears. He grabbed the suitcase and stormed into the house, determined to confront someone, anyone, who could provide answers. His stepdaughter, Brooke, was sprawled on the living room couch, scrolling on her phone. At 18, she had mastered the art of tuning out everything around her, but Sullivan's entrance shattered the tranquility. "Ever seen this before?" he demanded, holding the suitcase aloft like a weapon. Brooke glanced up, her expression a blend of indifference and mild annoyance. "What is it?" she asked, her tone dripping with the casual disdain teenagers reserve for authority figures. "This," Sullivan snapped, flipping the suitcase open and spilling its damning contents onto the coffee table. Letters tumbled out, followed by photographs and a cascade of receipts. Brooke's face flickered with something. Shock? Recognition? Or guilt? He couldn't tell. "Probably just some old luggage of Mom's," she said, her voice too calm, too measured. "You know how she keeps everything." "Don't play dumb with me, Brooke," Sullivan said, his voice rising. "You've seen this before, don't lie." Brooke's composure cracked for a moment, but she recovered quickly, folding her arms and leaning back into the couch. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Why don't you ask Mom when she gets back?" Sullivan clenched his fists, the edges of his vision darkening. Brooke's deflection only fueled his anger, but he knew pressing her further wouldn't get him anywhere. Instead, he turned his attention back to the pile of evidence, scanning the letters with an urgency that bordered on desperation. The letters were the most damning of all. Addressed to "My dearest Aurora" and signed Fletcher, they detailed an affair that spanned years. Fletcher Davis. His name leapt off the page like a slap to the face. The letters were filled with promises, declarations of love, and plans for a future that didn't include Sullivan. One passage struck him like a dagger. "I can't wait for the day we no longer have to hide. You mean the world to me, Aurora. Soon everything will fall into place. We'll finally be free." Sullivan felt the room closing in around him. The betrayal was staggering, but what cut deepest was the realization that this wasn't a fling. It was a life she'd been living behind his back, a life she'd chosen over their marriage. He threw the letter down, his jaw tightening. "How long have you known?" he demanded, rounding on Brooke. "Known what?" she retorted, her bravado slipping. "Look, I don't know anything, okay? Mom doesn't exactly tell me her secrets." "Don't lie to me, Brooke, if you're covering for her." "I'm not covering for anyone," she shot back, standing up. "Why don't you just call her and ask her yourself?" Sullivan's hand itched to grab his phone, but he hesitated. What would he even say? What would he say? What would his logic be? What would his reason possibly be that would make any of this make sense? His mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. "Fine," he said finally, his voice cold and measured. "But let me make one thing clear, Brooke. If you're lying to me, if you've been keeping her secrets, you're as guilty as she is." Brooke glared at him, her cheeks flushed with anger and something else. Shame? Fear? Sullivan couldn't be sure. She stormed upstairs without another word, leaving him alone with the suitcase and its damning contents. Sullivan sank into the couch, his head in his hands. The weight of the discovery pressed down on him, threatening to crush him under its enormity. Aurora's betrayal wasn't just a personal affront. It was a dismantling of everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, and the woman he'd shared it with. As the shadows in the room deepened, Sullivan stared at the photograph of Aurora and Fletcher, his mind churning with questions. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, what was he going to do about it? Sullivan didn't sleep that night. The suitcase sat on the dining table like a silent accuser, its contents sprawled out in damning clarity. With every passing hour, his anger gave way to cold determination. If Aurora thought she could live this double life, she had underestimated him. Sullivan wasn't just a husband betrayed. He was an accountant with a meticulous eye for detail, and now every skill he had would be put to use. He began with the receipts. One by one, he laid them out in chronological order, cross-referencing dates with Aurora's calendar. The pattern emerged quickly. Business trips to Chicago, conferences in New York, late meetings that never made sense. Each event lined up perfectly with hotel stays and extravagant dinners for two. The amounts were staggering. She wasn't just betraying him emotionally. She was funneling their shared finances into a life he had no part in. As Sullivan sifted through more evidence, he uncovered airline tickets for trips she'd never mentioned and credit card statements revealing purchases at upscale boutiques and jewelers. A receipt for an engraved watch caught his eye. The inscription read, "To Fletcher, my partner in life and love." His chest tightened and his hands shook, but he pressed on. The truth, no matter how painful, was better than living in ignorance. By dawn, he had pieced together nearly a decade of deceit. The letters provided the emotional context. Long, flowery professions of love from Fletcher, and Aurora's equally passionate replies. But it was the financial records that solidified the betrayal. Aurora hadn't just lied to him. She'd built an entire parallel existence with another man, funded by their joint resources. The sound of footsteps on the stairs snapped him out of his focus. Brooke appeared in the doorway, her expression guarded. She glanced at the mess of papers and receipts on the table, then at Sullivan. "You been up all night?" she said, her voice tentative. Sullivan fixed her with a steely gaze. "Sit down," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Brooke hesitated, but eventually sank into a chair, her arms folded defensively. "How many conferences were really rendezvous?" Sullivan demanded. holding up a receipt for a luxury hotel stay. How many late meetings were actually dinners? Brooke flinched but said nothing. Don't play coy with me, Brooke. You knew, didn't you? His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Brooke shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know everything, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I only figured it out recently. And instead of telling me, you chose to help her hide it. Sullivan's voice rose, and Brooke recoiled as if struck. How could you? She's my mom, Brooke shot back, her voice breaking. What was I supposed to do? Ruin everything? You think I'm the one who ruined everything? Sullivan said, incredulous. Your mother did that when she decided her affair was more important than this family. Brooke's eyes filled with tears, but Sullivan refused to back down. He leaned forward, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. How long have you been helping her, Brooke? Tell me the truth. Brooke wiped at her face and looked away. A few months, she admitted reluctantly. She asked me to cover for her when she was later, when Fletcher called. The mention of his name was like gasoline on Sullivan's simmering rage. Fletcher, he repeated, the name dripping with disdain. So, you knew about him too. Brooke nodded. I didn't want to get involved, but she made me feel like I didn't have a choice. She said it was for the best, that you wouldn't understand. Sullivan let out a bitter laugh. You're damn right I wouldn't understand. I don't understand how she could throw away everything we built, or how you could stand by and let it happen. I'm sorry, Brooke blurted out, her voice cracking. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. For a moment, Sullivan softened. Brooke wasn't the one who had betrayed him, not really. She was caught in the crossfire of Aurora's deceit, manipulated into complicity. But the damage was done, and forgiveness wouldn't come easily. You're still my dad, Brooke said quietly, her voice trembling. That hasn't changed. Sullivan looked at her, his anger tempered by the vulnerability in her words. You're my daughter, he said after a pause. But you've got to understand something. Trust is everything, and right now, I don't know who I can trust. Brooke nodded, guilt etched across her face. Sullivan turned away, his attention back on the papers spread out before him. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. Using his accounting skills, Sullivan began organizing the evidence systematically. He created folders for each year, dividing the receipts, letters, and photographs into categories. He scanned documents, saved them to a password-protected drive, and compiled a timeline of Aurora's betrayal. With each piece of evidence, the story became clearer, and so did his resolve. This wasn't just about confronting Aurora. It was about ensuring she couldn't deny what she'd done, about protecting himself from whatever lies she might try to spin. He knew Aurora well enough to anticipate her tactics. She'd deflect, deny, and manipulate if given the chance. Sullivan wouldn't give her that opportunity. By the time Aurora's flight was due to land, Sullivan had everything he needed. The garage, the suitcase, Brooke's reluctant confession, everything had led to this moment. He wasn't sure what he'd say when she walked through the door, but one thing was certain: Aurora wouldn't walk away unscathed. As the clock ticked toward her arrival, Sullivan stared at the neatly organized evidence, his jaw set with grim determination. The storm was coming, and he was ready. The tension in the house was palpable as Sullivan stood in the living room, staring Brooke down. The air felt heavy with unspoken accusations and the weight of betrayal. On the coffee table lay a DNA test kit, its presence more ominous than any of the damning evidence Sullivan had uncovered. Brooke sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers clutching the hem of her shirt as if holding on for dear life. "Open your mouth," Sullivan commanded, his voice low but firm, like the calm before a storm. "Let's settle this once and for all." "Dad, you don't need to do this," Brooke pleaded, her voice cracking. "I love you." "That won't change anything." Won't it? Sullivan shot back, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and sorrow. You knew about her affair, you helped her lie, and now when I'm supposed to believe you love me like nothing happened? Rook shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't have a choice. She's my mom. And I'm your father, Sullivan roared, slamming his hand on the table, making her jump. Or am I? Because right now, I'm not sure about anything anymore. The words hit Brooke like a blow, and for a moment she was silent. Then, with trembling hands, she picked up the swab. Fine, she whispered. If this is what you need to prove I'm still your daughter, then do it. Sullivan's jaw tightened as he watched her swab the inside of her cheek and seal the test. The sight was almost too much to bear, but his resolve didn't waver. He took the kit and set it aside, his gaze lingering on Brooke. Her tear-streaked face tugged at something deep inside him, but the wound her betrayal had left was still raw. This isn't about love, Brooke, he said, his voice softer now but no less resolute. It's about trust, and right now, I need the truth more than I need anything else. All right. When Aurora walked through the door that evening, she was met with a scene that felt like walking into the aftermath of a hurricane. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint rustle of papers on the dining table. Sullivan stood in the kitchen, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Hi, honey, she began, setting her bag down, but the words felt hollow, rehearsed, and Sullivan didn't respond. She hesitated, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. Is everything okay? Sit down, Aurora, Sullivan said, his tone devoid of warmth. Let's talk about Fletcher. Aurora froze, her face draining of color. Fletcher? She echoed, attempting to feign confusion. I don't know what you mean. Don't, Sullivan snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. He gestured to the table, where the letters, photographs, and receipts were spread out in meticulous order. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you don't know what this is. Aurora's eyes darted to the evidence and her knees buckled. She collapsed into the chair, her hands trembling as she reached for one of the photographs. Sullivan, it wasn't like that. Then what was it? He demanded, his voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been living a lie for years. How long, Aurora? How long have you been sneaking around with Fletcher while I was here, building a life for us? Tears streamed down Aurora's face as she shook her head. I loved you, she choked out. I still do. Love, Sullivan barked, slamming his fist on the table. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't betray. Aurora sobbed harder, clutching the photograph to her chest. I didn't mean for it to happen. I was lonely. You were always working, always so focused on everything but me. Don't you dare blame me for this, Sullivan hissed, leaning across the table. You had a choice. You could have talked to me, told me how you felt, but instead you decided to build a whole other life behind my back. Aurora's sobs turned into incoherent apologies, but Sullivan had heard enough. He pulled out a manila envelope and tossed it onto the table. Sign these, he said coldly. We're done. Aurora stared at the envelope in disbelief. Divorce papers? She whispered. Sullivan, please, we can work through this. No, Aurora, Sullivan said, his voice firm. We can't. You destroyed any chance of that the moment you chose him over me. Aurora hesitated, her hands shaking as she opened the envelope. Her eyes widened as she read the terms. You're leaving me with nothing? She asked, her voice rising in panic. How am I supposed to live? That's not my problem, Sullivan replied. And if you don't sign, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of woman you really are. Your company, your friends, everyone. What am I supposed to tell people? She cried, her tears renewed. Tell them the truth for once in your life, Sullivan said, his voice icy, or make up another lie. It's what you're good at. The days that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and shattered illusions. Sullivan ensured that Aurora's betrayal left her with nothing. He submitted the evidence to her company's HR department, exposing how she'd used corporate funds to cover her affair. The fallout was swift and brutal. Aurora lost her job, her reputation, and the comfortable life she'd built on deception. Brooke, too, faced the consequences of her actions. The DNA test confirmed what Sullivan had suspected. She wasn't his biological daughter. The revelation crushed him, but he refused to let it break him. Brooke begged for forgiveness, her tears genuine, but Sullivan couldn't bring himself to offer the absolution she sought. Instead, he told her she needed to find her own path, separate from the lies her mother had built. As the dust settled, Sullivan found himself standing in the garage where it had all begun. The suitcase was gone, the evidence boxed away, but the scars remained. Yet, for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of peace. He had faced the truth, no matter how painful, and emerged stronger. Love, he realized, wasn't about words or promises. It was about trust, loyalty, and respect, qualities Aurora had long abandoned. And while the future remained uncertain, Sullivan knew one thing for sure. He would never again settle for anything less than the truth. The sound of rain hammering against the cracked window filled the tiny apartment. Aurora sat hunched on a threadbare couch, a blanket wrapped tightly around her frail frame. Her once pristine appearance had faded into a shadow of itself, her skin pallid, her eyes sunken. The room reeked of dampness, mildew clinging to every corner. Across from her, Brooke stood in the kitchenette, wiping down a chipped countertop, her movements mechanical and devoid of energy. Life had not been kind to them in the aftermath of Sullivan's revelations. Evicted from their suburban home, they had bounced from one rundown apartment to another, until even that stability crumbled. Now, they shared a cramped room at a women's shelter, where Aurora's health had begun to deteriorate rapidly. Pneumonia had set in weeks ago, and without money for proper treatment, the illness had worsened. Brooke's hands trembled as she poured water into a mug, willing herself to keep it together. The diner job barely paid enough to cover their meager expenses, and the degrading treatment from customers and coworkers was wearing her down. But the sight of her mother, coughing violently in the corner, spurred her into action. "Mom," Brooke said softly, kneeling beside Aurora, "you need to see a doctor. You're not getting better." Aurora shook her head weakly. Her breath labored. We can't afford it," she rasped. "Just let me rest." Brooke's throat tightened as guilt and desperation clawed at her. She couldn't watch her mother waste away like this, not when there was one person who might still be able to help. The thought filled her with dread, but she had no other choice. Sullivan was in the middle of fixing a cabinet in his kitchen when the knock came. He wiped his hands on a towel and opened the door, only to find Brooke standing there, drenched from the rain. Her hair clung to her face, and her eyes were red, the weight of her circumstances written in every line of her expression. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling, "please, I need your help." Sullivan leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He didn't speak, his gaze cold and unyielding. "It's Mom," Brooke continued, her desperation spilling out. "She's sick. She has pneumonia, and we can't afford the treatment. Please, she's getting worse." For a moment, Sullivan said nothing. The silence between them stretched unbearably, the rain pounding on the roof the only sound. Then he straightened, his expression hardening further. "Your lies killed everything, Brooke," he said, his tone even but cutting. "I'm just making sure you face the consequences." Brooke flinched as if struck. "I know we hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "I know what we did was unforgivable, but this isn't about me. It's about Mom. She's going to die if she doesn't get help." Sullivan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He remembered Aurora's tears, her betrayal, the years of lies that had unraveled their family. he remembered Brooke's complicity, the way she had covered for her mother, helping her hide the affair. The memories burned like a fresh wound, and yet, somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that he was still a father, that Brooke, for all her faults, was still the little girl he had raised. But that voice wasn't loud enough to drown out the pain. "She made her choices," Sullivan said coldly, "and so did you. Now you have to live with them." "Please," Brooke whispered, her voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you, don't let her die." Sullivan's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, but he quickly buried the emotion. "Go home, Brooke," he said, stepping back inside. "This conversation is over." The door closed with a decisive click, leaving Brooke standing in the rain, her tears mixing with the downpour. The days that followed were a blur for Brooke. She worked double shifts at the diner, scrubbing floors and serving meals to rude truckers who leered and laughed at her. The money she earned barely stretched far enough to buy medicine for Aurora, and even then, it was never enough. Aurora's condition worsened, her coughs echoing through the shelter like a grim reminder of their reality. One evening, as Brooke sat on the cot beside her mother, she felt a wave of anger rise within her, not at Sullivan, but at herself, at the choices she had made that led them here. For the first time, she allowed herself to think about how different things could have been if she'd told Sullivan the truth from the beginning, if she'd hadn't let her mother manipulate her into silence. "I'm sorry, Mom," Brooke whispered, her voice barely audible. "I should have done more." Aurora reached out a trembling hand, brushing it weakly against Brooke's cheek. "You did what you could," she rasped. "I'm the one who ruined everything." Brooke shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We both did," she admitted, the weight of her guilt crushing her. "And now we're paying for it." Sullivan sat in his living room, staring at the fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows on his face. Brooke's words echoed in his mind, refusing to be silenced. He had told himself he was justified, that Aurora and Brooke deserved the consequences of their actions, but the image of Brooke, soaked and pleading, gnawed at his resolve. He had won. Aurora was out of his life, her betrayal exposed, her carefully constructed facade destroyed. Yet the victory felt hollow. The man he had become, cold, unyielding, and bitter, wasn't the man he wanted to be. With a heavy sigh, Sullivan reached for his phone. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen before dialing. The line rang twice before Brooke's exhausted voice answered. "Dad," she said, her tone laced with surprise and cautious hope. "Bring her to St. Mary's," Sullivan said gruffly. "I'll cover the hospital bills." There was a beat of silence, and then Brooke's breath hitched. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Dad." Sullivan ended the call without another word, leaning back in his chair. He told himself it wasn't forgiveness, just an act of decency. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was a step toward healing, not just for Brooke and Aurora, but for himself as well. The sound of applause filled the hall as Sullivan Weston stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding and deliberate. The event marked the official launch of the Truth in Fatherhood Foundation, a groundbreaking initiative he had conceived to support men deceived into raising children who weren't biologically theirs. The foundation promised legal aid, emotional support, and advocacy for legislative changes. Tools Sullivan wished he'd had during his own unraveling. He paused at the podium, surveying the crowd. Journalists, lawyers, and advocates sat side by side, with men who carried the same haunted look Sullivan once saw in his own reflection. This wasn't just a foundation, it was his new purpose, a way to transform betrayal into action, pain into power. "Actions have consequences," Sullivan began, his voice steady and strong. That's a lesson I've learned firsthand. Betrayal doesn't just break trust. It dismantles families, destroys futures, and leaves scars that never fully heal. But today, we're here to ensure that men like us have a voice, a community, and the strength to reclaim our lives. The applause rose again, louder this time, as Sullivan stepped back from the microphone. A flicker of satisfaction passed through him. Aurora and Fletcher had tried to shatter his world, but he had rebuilt himself stronger. Their downfall was as public as it was inevitable. Aurora had lost her job, her reputation, and the comfortable life she once took for granted. Fletcher, humiliated and ostracized after Sullivan exposed the affair, had fled to another state, his life in tatters. Sullivan had ensured that their actions would follow them like shadows, and yet, as he stood backstage, shaking hands and receiving congratulations, he couldn't ignore the small ache that lingered, a hollow space where his family used to be. It was late one evening when Brooke appeared on Sullivan's doorstep again, her figure illuminated by the glow of the porch light. She looked thinner, her cheeks hollow, her eyes pleading. She knocked softly, hesitant, and Sullivan hesitated himself before opening the door. "Ed," she began, her voice trembling, "please, just hear me out." Sullivan crossed his arms, leaning against the frame. "What is it this time?" Brooke swallowed hard, her hands twisting together. "I need your help. Mom's not getting better. The treatment you helped with bought us time, but she's still sick. The shelter won't keep us much longer, and the diner barely pays enough to keep us fed. I don't know what to do." Her words spilled out in a rush, desperation dripping from every syllable. "You raised me. You loved me. You're my real father. Please, don't turn your back on us now." Sullivan's expression didn't soften. Instead, his eyes grew colder, his voice sharper. "You want me to save you? After everything you've done? You and your mother made your bed, Brooke. Now you get to lie in it." "Dad, please," Brooke sobbed. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. But I've paid for it, haven't I? I've lost everything." "You lost everything because you chose lies over truth," Sullivan shot back. His tone was icy, his words measured. "The monsters aren't under your bed, Brooke. They're in your mirror." Brooke staggered back, his words cutting through her like shards of glass. "I can't do this alone," she whispered. "I need you." Sullivan's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he stepped back, the door still open between them. "Find someone else to help you," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "I'm done carrying the weight of your lies." He closed the door, shutting out Brooke's cries. Inside, he leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. The decision had been necessary, but it didn't make it easy. He had given her a chance and she had squandered it. There was no room in his life for second betrayals. The foundation became Sullivan's sole focus in the months that followed. He poured his energy into expanding its reach, hosting seminars and building a network of resources. The men he met shared stories that mirrored his own, tales of deception, heartbreak, and resilience. For each man he helped, Sullivan felt a piece of his own soul stitched back together. Aurora and Brooke, meanwhile, faded into the shadows of his life. Rumors trickled in from acquaintances. Aurora's health continued to decline, and Brooke had left the shelter, taking odd jobs to survive. Sullivan didn't inquire further. He had drawn a line, and he wouldn't cross it. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing grant applications, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Mom's gone. I thought you should know." Sullivan stared at the message, his emotions a tangled web of relief, sadness, and finality. He didn't respond. Instead, he set the phone aside and stared out the window at the city lights. Aurora's death felt like the closing of a chapter he hadn't realized was still open. On the anniversary of the Foundation's launch, Sullivan stood in the same hall where it all began. The audience was larger this time, the Foundation's impact undeniable. Sullivan's speech was brief but powerful, a testament to the resilience of men who refused to be broken by betrayal. After the event, a man approached him, his face familiar. "Mr. Weston," the man said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you. Your foundation helped me reclaim my life. I thought I'd lost everything, but you showed me I could rebuild." Sullivan shook the man's hand, a rare smile softening his features. "That's what we're here for," he said. As the crowd thinned and the hall emptied, Sullivan lingered, his thoughts drifting. He had lost much, but he had gained something greater, a purpose that extended beyond his own pain. Standing alone on the stage, Sullivan felt a quiet peace settle over him. His past was scarred, his relationships shattered, but he had emerged stronger, wiser. Aurora and Brooke had faced the full weight of their betrayal, and he had found a way to turn his suffering into strength. He left the hall that night with his head high, the sound of applause still echoing in his ears. The world hadn't broken him. It had forged him anew. Do you think Sullivan was right to refuse to help Aurora and Brooke one last time, or should he forgive them and give them another chance? Comment below.